Welcome to Breaking Down Patriarchy. I'm Amy McPhie Allebest. Recently, I was giving a big talk at a conference. I am totally comfortable with public speaking. In fact, it's one of my strengths. And I had done the research and I knew the content that I was presenting was incredibly valuable. And yet, in the hours before the presentation, I was consumed with self-doubt. My body was flooded with anxiety. I swore I would never accept a speaking engagement again. And one thought I had was, I wonder if I feel this way because of the way I was raised. I bet if I had gone to an Ivy League school when I was 18, if I had been raised to believe that it was okay for women to work outside the home, if I had seen women leaders, if I had pictured myself as anything other than a wife and mother, then I wouldn't be feeling so insecure. And maybe part of that is true. But when I started reading Kara Loewentheil's book, Take Back Your Brain, How a Sexist Society Gets in Your Head and How to Get It Out, I was shocked to read that this woman, this author, who literally attended Yale and Harvard as a young adult and has had high-powered jobs and leadership positions all through her adult life, sometimes struggled with the same kind of self-doubt that I did. So her book is an instruction manual on how to rewire that programming. And I am thrilled to welcome author Kara Loewentheil to talk about this book today. Welcome, Kara.
Thanks for having me. I mean, just the title of this podcast, as soon as we saw it, I was like, well, that's my natural home. I mean, let's go.
Awesome. Well, likewise, when I saw the title of your book, I was like, must order, must read that now. And honestly, I will say to listeners, I get this question and comment a lot from listeners and viewers on the YouTube channel too, like, doing the work of breaking down patriarchy and understanding the history and how we got here is super important. But the question I always get is like, okay, now what?
Mm-hmm.
Like, now I can see it. I see the things that are wrong in society. I even can like see the patriarchy that I've absorbed into my own brain. But how do I rewire from it? And your book was so incredibly helpful to me personally in doing that work. So thank you. Highly, highly recommend this book to listeners. Go out and buy it right now. And we'll tell you how to buy it in a second. Okay, first I'll just read your professional bio, Kara, and then we'll ask you to, the part where you just squirm in your chair like listening.
Oh, no, I have this, you know what? Women should be proud of their accomplishments. On my podcast, I make women brag about themselves, and it's so uncomfortable for people. Like, people come on and I say, I'm not doing an introduction. I'm going to introduce your name, and then I want you to talk about your accomplishments. And people are like very uncomfortable.
They are. Okay, do you want to do that then? Should I put you in the hot seat?
I'm happy to do that. I'll do it.
Okay,
All
Kara,
right.
tell us about yourself. Do it.
I come from what I call the very common Ivy League lawyer to life coach pipeline. I started my career as a lawyer. I've been a professional feminist my whole life, one way or the other. I went to Yale, as you said, and I was the coordinator of the Yale Women's Center and escorted at, reproductive service clinics and et cetera, et cetera. And then I graduated. I worked for Planned Parenthood as a media writer. And both in the reproductive rights movement and in my Jewish family, it was sort of like lawyer or doctor were kind of the two big career paths. And I was definitely not going to be a doctor. So I became a lawyer. And I had, I spent years kind of strategizing to get to the exact position I wanted, which was to be a reproductive rights litigator. There's maybe 20 of those jobs in the country. It's like a small group if you want to be practicing at a high level doing constitutional litigation, which is what I wanted to do. So I went to Harvard Law School and I clerked for a federal appeals court judge. And I sort of did all of these very mainstream like things you have to do. And I got that job. There was one litigation fellowship in reproductive rights the year I graduated, the year I finished my clerkship, because it was 2008. There was a kind of economic collapse. So funding had dried up for a lot of places. So I got that job. So I had my dream job at a national nonprofit that litigates all the big reproductive rights cases. And I had been working to get there for, 8 to 10 years. And I had that experience that I think a lot of women do, which is like, okay, I got the brass ring or the 12 brass rings, and I still don't feel confident or good about myself, right? All along the way, it was like, if I get into a good law school, well, okay, if I get a clerkship, if I get a federal clerkship, if I get an appellate clerkship, if I get a litigate, right? If I get the fellowship litigating, if I, then I'm finally going to feel good. And at a certain point, I had to admit that possibly the answer was not get the next career accomplishment. So, I wasn't quite ready to admit it. So first I went into academia because I thought, I didn't understand academia and I thought they had their summers off, which total lie. So if you ask any professor, so I did a fellowship at Yale and then I ran a think tank at Columbia. And I just, at that point, it really was clear that no accomplishment was going to change the way that I thought and felt. So I started, I had always I had gotten into yoga and then meditation. I had gone to therapy. I'd been on that fixing yourself journey that so many women go on. And around the time I started at Columbia, or I was finishing my second to last fellowship, I discovered the kind of coaching that I have built my work on the foundation of actually changing the way you think. And it was really powerful. It was not, when I found it, it was not sort of feminist in nature. It was like the underlying kind of cognitive tools. But even without the lens that I then later had to create, it was really powerful and helpful. And I just decided I was going to take this leap. And so I, instead of going on the market to get a law professor job, quit and became a life coach on the internet instead. And here I am 8 years later with a big famous podcast and a book coming out. And so what I'm saying is, everybody quit your job and get a job on the internet.
Perfect. That's what I'm telling my kids to grow up and do.
My parents have come around. They've adapted. It was a shock at first, for sure.
I bet. Okay, tell us about your podcast.
Yes.
And then a little bit about the book and where people can find it.
Yeah. The podcast, I assume I can curse.
You can.
On this. Okay. I'm always nervous. You never know. Sometimes
people can beep it or whatever.
That's true. That's true. And it's hard to, otherwise people are like, it's Unfork Your Brain, the podcast. And I'm like, it really loses something when you do that. So my podcast is called Unfuck Your Brain, Feminist Self-Help for Everyone. And that podcast really was the beginning of this particularly feminist bent to my work. And it really took off, I think, because there's such an appetite for it and such a desire for concrete tools. Because we didn't people asked me for my advice on the having a big podcast. I'm like, I didn't do any advertising. I didn't have any sponsorship. I didn't have, I just was teaching kind of things that I had found helpful, that I felt like they were news to me when I learned them. So it seemed like, other people needed to know them too. So that's the podcast. And then I've had the podcast since 2017, which is really wild to think about. So that's almost 7 years. And now I have my first book, which is Take Back Your Brain, How a Sexist Society Gets in Your Head and How to Get It Out. And the book is really designed to be a one-stop shop. So it has a little bit of everything, but it adds up to the whole of what you need. It has some of that historical and social context of explaining why we think and feel the way we do, and how these the beliefs that we've absorbed are kind of integrated into society in ways we don't even see, and how those impact the way that we actually think about ourselves. And then it also has very concrete tools for changing how you think, because I think a lot of women, or people socialized as women, have experienced what you're describing of, okay, now I'm aware, but I don't know what to do, which honestly is the same thing I and a lot of my clients experienced outside the feminist context in talk therapy of okay, I'm aware.
Totally.
I went through that where I was sort of okay, so we know, this is in the past. I'm engaged to a lovely man now, but it was in the past, it was okay, so I understand why I'm attracted to unavailable men, but what's the plan? Do I just keep doing it and watch myself do it? Do I chain myself to the radiator? How are we solving this? And I think cognitive change strategies are really the answer to both those questions of how do I take this awareness and actually make it something that I can not to sound like a tech bro, but operationalize in my life, right? How do I take the awareness that the reason I feel so insecure is socialization, and actually feel more confident, not just go through life still feeling insecure, but at least I guess knowing it's not my fault, which is better than nothing, but it's not as good as feeling confident.
Yeah. Awesome. Yes. I loved how you point out, I think multiple times in the book, just a little reminder too, of framing this book as, we think of it as a self-help book. And you point out when men talk about these issues of how to live the good life, we call it philosophy. And typically when women write about the exact same topics, we call it self-help. And it's thought of a little bit differently, right?
Yes. I think even in bookstores, even if we don't even get to philosophy, the same topics that for women are in self-help, for men are in leadership development, right? Or executive development, even sort of within the self-help genres, it's executive and leadership is kind of the male version, which is somehow more highfalutin than
Yeah.
just ladies trying to help themselves. But I think that a lot of the questions that my work asks and that I'm teaching my students to ask are those big questions. These are the questions that Aristotle and Plato and Socrates were asking. I went to Yale and I did directed studies, which is like a read all the books by the old dead white men,
Mm-hmm.
philosophers program essentially. But it has its benefits. And one of those is seeing the ways in which these are the same questions we're asking. Like, how do I know what's real? When you start to think about like, okay, what's actually happening and what's my thought about it? And what's the gap in between those things? That's a question of what is real? How do I come to know what I believe is reality? How do I experience whatever's outside of me? What meaning does my mind make of it? What kind of person do I want to be? What kind of person should I try to be? What are my responsibilities to myself or to my fellow people? What is the good life? Like, these are all questions that women are encouraged to never think about and to kind of be occupied with the day-to-day of life and be overloaded with the day-to-day of life because we are socialized to feel that we always have to be in service to everyone else in order to feel worthy or valuable. And so I think those questions are essential for any human, and that women have been socialized not to ask them, and women have been socialized not to trust their own answers. Like, we're socialized to believe that we are not the authority in our own lives and we can't be trusted to make big decisions. And I mean, sometimes I imagine this art piece that like is just voices yelling headlines from the internet and magazines at women from the moment they get up, with like each stage of your day the number of articles or reels or whatever out there, they're telling you that you don't know how to do it and you're doing it wrong. Like, what
Totally.
kind of water should you drink in the morning? And how should you what kind of skincare should you use? And like, what outfits are you allowed to wear for your body type? And what colors look good on you or not? And like, should you be drinking coffee? No, you should be drinking tea. No, it should be matcha. No, it should be mushrooms. Like, it's just endless. And
Yeah.
women just live with this like barrage of kind of explicit and implicit messages that we cannot possibly make our own decisions for ourselves. We're not doing Every woman I know thinks she's doing everything wrong all the time, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're kind of systematically stripped of like the time and ability to ask those questions and the trust in ourselves that we're allowed to make those decisions for ourselves. So I think of it as practical philosophy. And of course, it's self help because women and other marginalized people have always had to help themselves. And if you think about, I'm not in any way against conventional therapy, even mainstream coaching. Like, there's a lot of benefit to both those things. Also, primarily, both created by white men who were
Mm-hmm.
not sitting around asking themselves, I wonder how this changes if you're socialized as a woman. Like, that didn't occur to them. They
Totally.
didn't give a shit. They weren't socialized as women. So we're going to have to make our own way, help each other, help ourselves, learn a different approach, because the mainstream, even of the self-help industry, is not going to deliver that to us.
Hmm. So true. Okay, thanks for that framing. Let's dive into the book. I have so many questions for you and like passages that I want to highlight for listeners. I loved that you were so personal and vulnerable, and you opened the book, um, as I mentioned in the intro, with a scene where you were having a little bit of a moment,
Mhm.
where you were feeling like it seems like flooded with self doubt, sobbing under your desk. Can you talk about that moment and kind of what that symbolized for you?
Yeah, although it's funny to call it that moment because that was not the only moment that I was
Mhm.
crying under the desk, just the one that starts the book. Yeah, I mean, I think that I really experienced, like so many times, the when I get there, I'm going to feel confident. Like, okay, I don't feel confident after college, but like if I get into a top law school, okay, I got into like the number two law school at the time. Well, but I'll feel confident if I get a clerkship, if. And it didn't matter, right? And every woman I know and every person socialized as a woman I know has experienced the kind of the way in which if your brain is programmed to believe that you are always not doing enough and not good enough, which is what we're socialized to believe, your brain will always move the milestone, right? It always moves the marker. Or if you do succeed, then it has some reason that it doesn't count. It's like, oh, it turns out it wasn't as hard as I thought. Or like, oh no, I only got that promotion because like I work hard. It's not because I'm smart or because I'm friendly with so and so, or they were just being nice. Like, the number of women I have coached who think somebody married them or promoted them just to be nice to them, which is like also hilarious because that's not really how men are socialized to act. So I
True.
don't think that's what's happening. Like, straight men aren't socialized to marry women just to be nice to them as a
Yeah.
favor. Um, so I think that I experienced that insecurity my whole life until I found coaching. And I also don't ever sell coaching as like, you'll never have a negative thought again. Like, you have a human brain. My brain's still like, I've done so many podcast interviews for my book, and my brain, has its own favorite thing, which is like, oh, you talk too much, and like, you could be more
Mhm.
succinct, and you should both, and I've done a lot of work to kind of reframe for myself of like, this is how I talk. So I might as well think it's a strength. Obviously, it's worked pretty well. But that conversation still runs on. The big difference is the way that I relate to and engage with those thoughts. So when you start rewiring your brain, you start changing your thinking. Like, some thought patterns will eventually just go away and you don't have to deal with them anymore, which is awesome. That's not what happens for all of them, but your relationship to them changes. It becomes much more when like your kid is really upset about
Mhm.
something doesn't matter,
Yeah.
and you're just like, okay, I know it's very upset. You can be compassionate, but you're not like sucked in to like, oh my god, I am a stupid idiot. You're just sort of like,
Mhm.
okay, I hear you. I know. That's what a thought I have, and I don't really believe it anymore. It's just sort of like a ghost thought. So I think like that's where I've come to, but um I really want to normalize that, like, when you start changing your thinking, your your old thoughts don't just like disappear. I mean, this is part of the problem, is like that people think either awareness will just change their thinking, like, oh, now I know why I feel insecure.
Mhm.
Why is it still here? But awareness doesn't change your brain's neurological structure, right? And even when you start thinking something new, you're strengthening one neural pathway, but you still have a really strong old one, and it's going to take a while for the new one to become dominant. Because I think a lot of people start trying things and then they just quit before they give it enough time
Yep.
to like really sink in and work.
Yeah, I think we're probably all guilty of that in some area of our lives. And I am, I think, in this one, which was why like sticking with the book and like thinking I'm actually going to do these exercises. I'm going to put myself through the paces. I mean, just like anything else, to actually
Yeah.
make the changes. So I want to back up just a little bit and examine that voice. You call it the voice
Hmm.
in the book. And have you talk a bit about where it comes from. And I know I want to say here too, a lot of the men in my life also struggle
Totally.
with similar things of self-doubt and imposter syndrome and a lot of pressures, but there is something specific that I think women typically experience differently. So can you talk about the voice that women tend
Yeah.
to experience?
Well, also, and I want to like say in response to that, patriarchy is bad for everybody. So like,
Yep.
there can be like, the next book will be for men, take back your brain. Like, there's
Yeah.
obviously a lot of ways that men are socialized that are very detrimental, that keep them from like connecting to their emotions and being vulnerable and being intimate and like all sorts of things. So patriarchy is bad for everyone. This is just where I focus. To me, the difference I see, it's like, I am engaged to a man and he has lots of some of these, a lot of these thought patterns also. The
Mhm.
difference I see is like, for women, it's always getting related back to like, I'm basically not worthy and shouldn't exist.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, I will see that men have, yes, like, might have imposter syndrome, or might have like insecurity about their body, or might have whatever, but it often doesn't seem to go like as directly to this sort of like, therefore, you
Mhm.
know, I don't deserve to, for any, no one would ever like, I don't feel good about my body doesn't somehow quite translate all the way to like, therefore my body's disgusting, I need to hide it, I could never let anyone see me naked, no one would ever be attracted to me. Like, it's like women are so socialized that in this way of thinking of like, sort of anything, you're supposed to be perfect, and so anything that's wrong with you, quote unquote wrong with you, is like a strike at your very sort of worth or value or deservingness of anything. And
Mhm.
again, yes, some men struggle with that as well, but I do think that the way that women are socialized to believe that our worth and value essentially come from other people's opinions of us, other people's perceptions of us, and the never ending impossible struggle to live up to impossible standards. So I think women are sort of seem to be more often on a day-to-day basis, like questioning their own, worth and value and sort of right to exist. It sounds dramatic, but when you work with people's brains all day, like I do, you like really see the thoughts they have that they're not even
Mhm.
aware of or wouldn't necessarily admit to. Like, most women won't say at the beginning of a conversation, oh yeah, I don't know if I'm good enough to exist. Like, we don't have that thought consciously playing in our head all the time. But when
Mhm.
you start coaching and you start getting into like those tender parts, or the places that people feel really insecure or really rejected or whatever, like, that's what you get down to, is some variation of, I'm not worthy of love. Like, I'm not good enough to be accepted or to have relationships or to like for anyone to care about me, you know.
Mhm.
So I think, sorry, this may have got off on a
No,
on a little bit
that's
of a
great.
tangent, but I
Not at
think
all.
that is so deep. So the voice, that's what you'd ask me. The voice is um what I call that sort of internal monologue. Some people have a very verbal internal monologue that they're very aware of. Like mine is like having another person. There's like it's a whole conversation. Some people, it may be more pieces here and there. Some people are not as used to tuning in to their own thinking. So they
Mm,
have like, you know, they're sort of not as aware of their thoughts. Some people may be more visual, maybe they see more images, but the voice is sort of the way that socialization comes out in our brains, right? Because we pick up all these messages implicitly and explicitly from society our whole lives, like who do you see as the, you know, heroine in the movies and what does she look like? And then who's the CEO of everybody's company? And then who's at home with their kids? And then like, who are people asking about losing weight or not? Or who are people asking about getting engaged or not? It's just like constant gender, you know, signals and messages that we're absorbing. But then it's sort of like your brain has all these Lego pieces and then it's just like building thoughts for you out of these pieces, but they sound like you.
mm,
So if you heard it in like a male announcer voice or something being like, women with cellulite should be ashamed of themselves, like it wouldn't be as painful, right? You'd be like, oh, that's the patriarchy. That's what that is. But
yeah.
that's not what you hear. What you hear is like, oh my God, like I don't know if I should wear shorts this summer. Like, you know, I know I'm supposed to be confident, but like my legs remind me of my grandmother's legs and they shouldn't look like that. And I, you know, maybe one of those treatments online does where it's like, it sounds like your voice, right, is the problem. And so we just tend to believe our brains are telling us the truth, which is the biggest scam in the world because your brain is almost never telling you the truth.
Mhm.
But we think it just is factually observing and narrating to us. And so the voice becomes that like really oppressive internalization of all of these messages that we don't even realize are external messages because they just sound like us. They just sound like our thoughts.
Mm, such a good point. That's one of the trickiest things for me to figure out, and in parenting my kids also. And we
Mm-hmm.
talk about it a lot, when to believe yourself and when not to.
Ugh.
And it's a
And there's like
lifelong
no
process.
easy answer.
There's not.
It would be great if there was, but there like really isn't. Sometimes you are going to believe something dumb your brain said, and sometimes you're going to dismiss something that was true. But I
Yeah.
think that also like one of the things I see in the women I coach so much is this desire to have the exact right answer,
Yeah.
right? Because we don't trust ourselves and we don't think we're allowed to make mistakes. It's like women are socialized to believe that there's sort of zero room for error,
Mm,
right? And any mistake is fatal and is a sign that they are like bad at whatever it was or can't trust themselves or unworthy. So I'm constantly getting questions like that. Like, how do I know when to trust myself and when not to? And I'm like, I wish I could give you a 3-part test or like a little die test you could do or
yeah.
something, but
Yeah.
there's literally you just have to decide, right?
Yeah.
There's no equation. You're not always going to get it right. And
Mhm.
I'm much less concerned about, are you making the right decision, quote unquote? And I'm much more concerned with, how do you talk to yourself when a decision doesn't work out the way you want?
Yep. Yep.
Like, what is your relationship with yourself when you do try something and fail, or someone does reject you? You know, how are you talking to yourself then? That is what is the most important.
Yep. Yeah, that's great. Okay, we're going to pivot to a different topic that
Okay.
you bring up in the book, and that's feminism. Um, we've talked a bunch on the podcast about feminism, but it still is such a polarizing word, which is so silly to me. I mean, I'm a big like fan of looking at a dictionary. If
Hmm.
there's a word that everybody's arguing about, like just look it up in the frickin' dictionary and let's agree on a definition. Then you can decide if
Hmm.
you know, agree with it or not. But tell us what feminism actually means. And I loved your 3 options regarding like, here are the options of your stance on feminism. What are they?
Yeah. I mean, I'll say this is how I define it. I'm never trying to get into a fight about objective truth. It's all just thoughts, man. Everybody's got their own thoughts. But the way that I think about feminism is that it is actually not really about women, even specifically. It is the
Mhm.
belief that people should have the same options and rights and opportunities regardless of their gender, because there aren't only two genders. Feminism isn't just about women and men, right? There's
Mhm.
a spectrum of gender. So what I say in the book is that people seem to think that there's this like neutral thing they can be where they're not a feminist and they're not a sexist. And I'm saying I don't think that's true. You can either think that regardless, like there's first, if you start at the top, there's two camps. One, people of all genders should have the same rights and opportunities and equity and equity and equality. Other camp, no, some genders should have different and better rights, or we have a belief that one gender is better than the other. That's it. Those are the two camps. So if we're sticking in the kind of heteronormative paradigm of like man and woman, then you could be a misogynist, which means you think that, women are inferior. You could be a misandrist, which you think men are inferior, which is like just the fact that almost no one knows that word and that it seems hilarious to say you'd choose that as a policy perspective just shows you how sexist our society is. So it's like you could be a misogynist, you think men should have more rights. You could be a misandrist, you think women should. Or you can be a feminist and think that people should have the same amount of rights. So those are your three buckets. You don't get to be a neutral that's not sexist. That is a feminist.
Yep. Here. Bravo. I loved that. And I love how simple it is. It's not complicated in my view. So I loved your explanation of that. Okay. Another question on a topic related to this is lately I'm seeing a lot of women doubling down on gender essentialism. Like, for example, saying like, well, we need to reclaim emotion and intuition because men are more logical, but women are more emotional. So lean into your emotions. And that's the way they want to be feminist.
Oh God, so many soapboxes I have about this. I have so many thoughts and feelings.
Yeah. Up on the soapbox you go.
I'll try not. With this short soapbox would be the right ways. Because you can imagine in the self-help wellnessy world, oh my God, there's so much like divine feminine and divine masculine. And like, those are not actually gendered. You cannot just take a word that has been something for 1,000 years and just declare that it doesn't mean that thing. So I just think it's ridiculous to claim, like, if you want to talk about different types of attributes, okay, like you could make whatever collection or schema of attributes you want to make and call them whatever you want. But when you call things masculine or feminine, you are bringing up I think schema is the right word for a psychological shortcut, it's not the right word. You're bringing up a schema that people have been socialized with about what is masculine and what is feminine. So you can't, I don't know, it'd be like me saying like, these are blue, but they're not blue. They just look like blue. Or I can't even think of like a good example for it. Yep. So I just don't think you can't divorce the words from that historical context. And I think there's always, as somebody who started my career doing like, policy and historical and legal analysis, there's always an interesting way in which radical extremists end up converging, right? So you'll see that in like sort of radical conservatives who believe like there are only two genders and, everybody is the sex you're assigned to at birth is your correct gender, and there are only two, and they need to marry each other, and everybody needs to be straight, and everybody's defined by their genitalia. So that's like one side of the horseshoe, and then you have like radical feminists with a big focus on biological gender and kind of on from the 70s, like, and the sort of unique what's the right word, social context and vulnerabilities of women based on biological gender. Like, so those horseshoes like come around.
Yep.
Right. And they end up almost meeting. So I just think we see that in every generation, that like there's a version of, even though people would say that they are like, some people who are talking this way, like it would be fun to do Mad Libs where you take off the like identifiers and you just mix up the terms and then see if you can identify whether it was a like very right-wing conservative or a very like woo-woo supposedly left-wing person who said it, and like the horseshoes converging.
True. Yeah. You can see that with like anti-vax stuff too, right? It's like the most conservative and the most liberal.
Yes.
And you go
it's like coming back around.
It comes back
it's
around
like they're both distrusting authority in different ways.
Yes, exactly. Okay. Well, it's super interesting, and I thought really important also. Okay. Another really great point that you make that I loved. You talk about, well, the whole book, that one of the points is to deprogram and rewire our brains. That's super hard work. So what do you say to people, usually other feminists, who say, I shouldn't have to do this work, working on me? Why should I have to change? It's men who should have to change, or the world should have to change. I shouldn't have to change. So how do you answer that?
Yeah. I mean, I have two answers. One is you don't have to. Like, you get to decide. The book is not here to tell you should do anything.
Mm-hmm.
So number one, you always get to decide. I'm not telling you what to do. Like people, like whenever I get people sort of, there's like sometimes I think coaches get confused. Like there's, what's the right way to say this? Sometimes people get concerned that life coaching is culty, and I'm always like, I don't want to be in charge of anything you do. Cult leaders want to be in charge of like what you wear and what you eat and what I'm like, I can barely handle myself. Like I'm not here to tell you to do anything. So number one, you don't have to change. Number two, your experience is being created, your emotional experience is being created by the way that you think and react to the world. So you get to decide if you are cool with your emotional experience and the way that you're acting based on it, or if you're not. And you get to decide if you're not, how are you going to deal with that? Do you want to go to therapy? Do you want to do ayahuasca? Do you want to try coaching? Like, up to you. You get to decide. But number three, we have so much focus on policy and structural issues and how everybody else needs to change in feminism. And we don't spend a lot of time talking about the ways that we might also be complicit in and contributing to the perpetuation of these systems. Or we talk about that in a very virtue signaling way, but we're not actually doing that work internally. And from my perspective, like we internalize these social beliefs. That's how they keep getting created out there in the world, right? We're all living them out because they have been programmed into us so deeply. And so even if you're someone who says like, I don't give a shit about my emotional experience, I just want to create policy change, whose brain is creating policy change? Like if your brain is deeply programmed and captured by patriarchy, which I promise you it is, even if you're a feminist like me, mine was too, then the ideas you come up with, the way you can communicate, like all of that has come from your brain. Everybody who's ever changed society, it was because they had managed to get themselves to like an independent perspective that was different from what society told them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think like, let's keep 90% of the focus of the movement on policy and structure, but like, can we have 10% focus on like what it's done to our brains and our emotional health and our emotional lives? And I actually think that would make feminism, I think it would help more people see the value of feminism because like the political awareness of feminism is such an awakening for people. And as you said in the very beginning, it often leaves them feeling like, well, now I just hate everything and everyone. I don't know what to do about it. And I still got to live in this world. And also I still like my dad and my brothers. And like, what am I supposed, I'm living a complex human life that doesn't completely map up onto this structural analysis. And I think that this internal work gives us a way to bridge and integrate those things and live our values more from the inside out.
Yes. Love it. Love it. It just seems like sound principles too, in terms of like anyone who's gone to couples therapy too, like you have to make a plan for if the partner doesn't change. Like the world may not change as much as we want to see it change in our lifetimes. What are we going to do in the meantime to
right?
just
And also like we're part of the world. The world isn't this other thing that we can be like, I'll just be static and then the world is going to change. Like, I talk a lot in the book about the different ways that we reenact oppressive systems because we've internalized them. That doesn't mean that it's our fault.
Yep.
I'm not really that interested in like the assignation of fault. I just don't think that that's all that useful. Like that doesn't mean it's our fault or it's the victim's fault or anything like that. It just means, of course, if you grow up in a sexist or a fatphobic or a homophobic or a, ableist or a racist society, like you've absorbed those ways of thinking. And if you don't try to become aware of them and change them, you are unavoidably going to replicate the systems that you're trying to escape.
Yep, for sure. Okay, well, speaking of that, can you tell us about the concept of the brain gap? I thought that was a really useful phrase.
Yeah. So the brain gap is this gap that women experience between how they want to think and feel and how they actually think and feel. And so it might sound something like what you described in the beginning. I know I should feel confident speaking because I've done this before and it's a big part of what I do. And I know this is valuable, but I still feel really anxious and insecure, right? So it's that split brain experience of like, I want to think and feel a certain way, or I think I should think and feel a certain way, but I don't. One of the examples I give in the book that was very salient for me was that when I was, before I found coaching, dating was one of my like big kind of areas I needed to work on rewiring my brain. And I had this very like this big brain gap between like, well, I want to believe that women don't need to be married or in a relationship, and a man doesn't like define you or validate you, and like who cares what men think and blah blah blah. And yet I'm like obsessively refreshing the Tinder queue to see if a match messaged me back yet. Like there's a gap there. What is that? That's the brain gap. That is the difference between basically two different thought patterns, which is really important to understand, because when we frame it to ourselves as, well, I want to think this, but I actually feel this, we don't know what to do with that. What are you supposed to do? You just have a conflicting thought and feeling, like you're screwed. When you think of these as two different thought patterns, which you probably learned at different times in your life, now we can more understand the conflict, because from very young, you're absorbing messaging around the importance of romantic love in a woman's life, that women should be very focused on their romantic life, that no matter what else a woman accomplishes, if she's not married and doesn't have kids, it's somehow sad, or she's failed at something, that an older woman who isn't married and doesn't have kids, something's gone wrong. Like, so you're absorbing all of that. Okay, and then when you're 20, 15, even if it's when you're 12, you discover feminism and you start, right, you sort of start hearing other messages and you start wanting to believe those. We still got like good 10 years there of really primal socialization around what you have to do to be judged like worthy and okay by your society, which for humans is a real primitive brain survival kind of desire. So that's the brain gap. It's that gap between those two or more thought patterns. And the only way we can change that brain gap is by, rather than just trying to tell ourselves to believe this great thought we wish we believed, using the tools I teach in the book to like get very clear on what can we actually believe now, and then building our way towards that better belief and ending up with like one integrated thought pattern. But if you don't do that, you just end up stuck and ping-ponging, because your brain just has these two different thoughts and they're not compatible and it doesn't know what to do.
Yep. So one of the most useful exercises in the book for me was the ladder exercise, to do that very thing, to like, okay, I recognize I'm at A and I can even see why I want to be at B, but I don't know how to get there. Can you talk about the ladder?
Yeah. So the thought ladder is a tool that helps you go from what you're believing now to what you want to believe. What I think it's like a a crime of the self-help community that like what most people have heard of is just positive thinking or affirmations, which generally don't work. And there's at least one study that I cite in the book that shows that trying to like practice positive thinking can actually backfire and make you feel worse when you don't believe those thoughts, because it just like emphasizes how far you are from what you want to believe and how impossible that seems to you. So they're not helpful, but that's the only tool people are given, is just like think positively or good vibrations or whatever. So the thought ladder teaches you like how do you create what I call a 10% less shitty thought, because we're really just going for incremental change, right? So it's like you can't go to the gym and be like, I want to deadlift 400 pounds. I've never done anything. Let me try to pick that up. Like you're going to break your back. It's not even going to come off the floor. Nothing's going to happen. You got to go and start small and start lifting and build your way up. And the same is true for your brain. Your brain's not a muscle, but you can say any sentence to yourself. I can say to myself, the lizard people built the pyramids. Like, I don't believe that. There's no emotional payoff in my body. And the same thing happens if you're trying to go from, I hate my stomach, to I'm a beautiful goddess. Like you can say the words to yourself. There's no emotional payoff. It doesn't feel like anything. You haven't changed your thought. But when you start with a 10% less shitty thought, something like, this is a human stomach. There are other stomachs in the world that look like this. Like that is a neutral thought. I always say your neutral thought should not look inspirational on Pinterest. Like you wouldn't put it on an Instagram graphic. It's not, nobody would share it with like a heart. It's like really just what can you literally actually believe now that feels a tiny bit better in your body, where you get 10% relief from how bad you feel when you think your current original thought. That's how you can move mountains with like that approach. But you have to really start with those small actionable steps. And so in the book, I give a bunch of kind of prompts also to help you like develop those thoughts. And of course, I teach that in depth also in my membership program, the Feminist Self-Help Society. But the book gives you a really good start at using that tool.
Yeah, I thought it was so helpful. I did it on a couple of different things, and it was, I mean, even in just a few minutes, drawing it out on a piece of paper actually really helped me.
This is the thing, y'all. It's like we're like, if I can't get there in 2 seconds, I don't want to go at all. And I'm like, well, I can get you there in 6 seconds. Like, let's just can we be the tiniest bit patient? Like, you
Yeah.
can actually change how you feel pretty quickly if you're willing to just, you know, just take a little step on the way.
Yeah. Yeah. So true. Okay. I want to talk about just a few different topics. You bring up a bunch in the book, but maybe we'll just drop into a couple. One of them that really resonated for me was the concept of rewiring our brains on having agency and the power to act
Mhm.
versus just waiting for life to happen to us. And you talk about how specifically how patriarchy has socialized women to have that
Mhm.
approach of just like being kind of passive and life happening to us. Can you talk about how we've been kind of raised or conditioned to believe that, and then what we can do to retrain ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think women are socialized and brought up to sort of not trust in their own um and not trust in their own efficacy or agency. And I want to say this stuff is relative. So, like, I obviously am somebody who believes my own agency and efficacy to a pretty high degree. I've like created all of these outcomes, but there's still places that I see that I'm like, probably a man with my success record would like think that he could go twice as far. And I'm like, maybe one more third, right? Like it's all relative. So
Yeah.
I'm never saying, I mean, I know so many strong women. I'm never saying that like women are like spineless jellyfish flopping around on the floor, right? It's all, but if you look inside and look at like, okay, where do I see my own self-doubt still? Like,
Mm-hmm.
so it's all sort of from wherever you're starting from naturally.
Mm-hmm.
So women are more, I think, socialized to put their head down, work hard, and wait to be rewarded, right? Women get more of that messaging of like, don't ask for too much, don't seem greedy, don't seem ungrateful, don't think too well of yourself, like, don't get too big for your britches, right? We see society often tearing down women who have accomplished things or
Mm-hmm.
critiquing women. I mean, Oprah's like, people are talking about Oprah's weight all the time. Woman is
Mm-hmm.
like incredibly successful, came from nothing. And like, what does society wants to constantly talk about? How much adipose tissue is on her body, right? So there's just all these ways that we are sort of it's constantly enforced to us, and then that's a big scale, and then that happens in smaller communities. It's like somebody gets divorced, or somebody made a mistake, or somebody had an affair, or some whatever.
Mm-hmm.
There's just this sort of, you can go from like the Scarlet Letter all the way up till now. So I think that there's um women are socialized to have that sort of like, oh, if I make one misstep, that's it, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
something wrong with me. Everybody's going to come for me. And there's also, I had a therapist on my podcast recently, is after the book, so it's not in the book, but she was talking about the study that showed that parents who are dealing with young kids will like intervene to protect girls
Mm-hmm.
earlier than with boys. So
Mm-hmm.
like
Yep.
if a girl makes a mistake or makes a mess, they'll like swoop in and like fix it for her, whereas boys are allowed to kind of like make a mistake and make a mess and figure it out. So girls get the message of like, you shouldn't ever screw it up, you shouldn't ever make a mistake, you shouldn't ever make a mess, and that girls tend to be more praised for being perfect, quote unquote, like, oh, that drawing is so perfect, oh, you look so perfect. So women just have this perfectionism, kind of bred very deeply. And then I think when you look historically, there has historically been a lot of negative consequences for stepping out of line. I mean, talk about the Scarlet Letter, right? Or like when I teach a webinar I do called the Feminist Anxiety Fix, I show often a picture of a scold's bridle, like something that
Mm.
was put on women who were like nagging or scolds. So there's so much, historical and probably even epigenetic like trauma around standing out, speaking up to authority, wanting more than you're given or wanting more than you have. And I think all of that contributes to women, staying small because being small feels safer.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Okay, two more topics of the, like I said, a really great list of lots of different ones. But one that I want to hear you talk about is love and sex. And then the other one is money, women's relationship with making money.
So the book goes into so much more than I can cover here. But
Yeah.
one of the things that I think is really important in the book, in the chapter around relationships is, and romantic relationships, is what I call the four traps of romantic socializations. These are the kind of the thought patterns that women are socialized to have in their around their romantic relationships, which are insecurity, scarcity and settling, fixation and rumination, and magical thinking. And so the book kind of goes deeper into each of those thought traps, kind of. So if you're somebody who struggles in your dating life or who struggles in your romantic relationships, whether that's like having a lot of sort of relationships that didn't work out the way you wanted, or you're in a relationship but you just feel very emotionally up and down about it. I think like at least one of those 4 traps is at play. And then one of my favorite things about that's a very long chapter, and part of it's parts about dating and love and part is about sex. And my favorite thing that I learned writing the book and the part about sex was that there's a term for this phenomenon that I had been coaching on for years, which is the term is object of affirmation based arousal or
Mm.
desire. And it's the idea that women are socialized I knew that women were socialized to see themselves as sexual objects. What I've observed in coaching is that women then become socialized to only be able to feel arousal if they feel they're being actively desired. And
Mhm.
so I would coach a lot of women who were saying like, well, my partner's not making me feel sexy, which like, I'm sure some men have said that, but in general, men are socialized to see themselves as the sexual actors and as their own sexual desire as being something that arises organically within them just because they are a man. And then that desire finds people or things to attach to, or maybe that desire is evoked by someone else just existing, right? But it's about their desire. Whereas women talk about it as like, I can't feel sexy, by which they mean worthy of desire,
Mhm.
right? They're not really talking about their own arousal. They're talking about, I don't feel desired, which is what I associate with like being in the mindset or the physical state to have sex. So I was thrilled to find like a name for that. And I talk
Mhm.
in the book about why it's so important and how to be able to create your own feeling of arousal or sexual desire or sexual agency, because you don't want to have that be dependent on how someone else is acting.
Yeah, totally. And that just like we're talking about in all of these different areas, like being the subject of your own life,
Yes. Yeah.
being
It's
the
like being
actor.
the person, the hero of your, like, I mean, it really is just subject.
Yeah.
Sometimes I feel like what I'm teaching just boils down to like, yeah, I just want women to think that they are actual autonomous human beings who are the
Yeah.
subject, who are the sort of, um,
Like the
it's like the
protagonist.
actor of their own lives, like the central character of
Yeah.
their own lives, who exist and can act upon the world in the same way that men are socialized to see themselves as doing.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, how about money? This was a really interesting one, and listeners know about my personal background too. I was raised in a very conservative religion that was still teaching girls and women to never work outside the home, right?
Mhm.
And so I've had to really navigate this as an adult and since a feminist awakening, really rewiring all kinds of
Mhm.
assumptions and feelings that I have about money. So, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and I mean, I was raised in a family that assumed I'd have a career, but I still had to do a ton of rewiring because I came up sort of identifying with working in the nonprofit world and thinking that people who care about money are bad or people who want to make money are bad.
Hmm.
Um, and so I had to do a lot. It's very hard to run a business when you have those thoughts. So I had to do a
Yeah.
lot of rewiring from a different direction. Yeah. So in the book, I talk about the 3 money lies that I think society teaches women. And one is that money is for men. Then, I mean, the number of women I have coached who just believe that they are irresponsible with money,
Hmm.
and they can always give you evidence because you can always like distort everything that's happened to you to fit your paradigm, right? Or you can always look back and be like, I shouldn't have bought that lipstick in 2019. If I'd invested that $12, it would be whatever.
Yeah.
So women are really socialized to believe that um, men are better at making money, that
Mhm.
men are better at math and understand the stock market and finances better, even though studies show that actually women make better investors than men. They have better investment outcomes than men because they are essentially less arrogant about
Mhm.
like they actually read things and consider and think about them more, and they don't just blindly trust their own opinions as much. um and I think a lot of this comes from the socialization because women, if you ask most women what it means to be good with money, they'll say being thrifty or being like not overspending. It's very similar to like diet culture. It's like restriction, sticking to a plan, etc. Whereas most men will say like making money, creating wealth, right? And the media we get is totally targeted that way. You know, there's studies that I talk about in the book showing that most of the media targeted at men around money is take risk, create wealth, build a portfolio, whatever. And at women, it's like how to budget, how to be thrifty, how to save money. And historically, women didn't have their own money. So you were just given some amount as your household purse that you were supposed to manage. So that socialization is still impacting us so deeply today. So that's the first lie, is that money is for men. The second lie is that wanting money makes you a bad person,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think this is something that we certainly weaponize against women a lot more. I see that like especially in the being in the kind of self-help and wellness space. I mean, I don't really think of myself as in the wellness space, but like in the self-help coaching, whatever space, the people making the most money, a lot of them are still men. It's sort of
Mm.
like many professions where like most of the people in the profession are women, but then the top people are men.
Yep.
And like, I just don't see a lot of hate targeted at them for
Yeah.
like building multi-million-dollar businesses and wanting to make money and create wealth. Like that's just assumed to be like natural for a man.
Yeah.
But there is so much drama around women entrepreneurs wanting to make money in the self-help or wellness spaces, or women, yeah, like people, the idea that you could both want to help people and make money is like anathema for women, because women are just supposed to help everybody for free all the time until like the giving tree, they just die.
Yep.
Like that is how women are socialized. So that's lie number 2. And then lie number 3 is the idea that you can sort of just opt out
Mm.
and that doesn't have any impact on the world.
Hmm.
Right. And I think that that is tied to the way women are socialized. They see themselves as sort of like not full economic participants in society. So it's sort of just like, well, I can just walk away. Like, I'm not really part of this. I don't have to participate in it. But, you know, when you, and I'm not a wealth coach. I don't think everybody needs to want to make money or build wealth. But I want women to have done the deprogramming to choose on purpose. Like, if you just love couponing, great. If that's really because you just love it and not because you believe you're incapable of making money, or that it would make you a bad person if you wanted to make money, or that you are somehow demonstrating virtue through the restraint of couponing or whatever other socialization there is. Because when we try to opt out, then the current unequal distribution of resources just intensifies,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it just goes back to that same conversation we were having about you can't, like, we've internalized all of it and we're acting it out. So we can't just say like the problem is over there. We're all part of it. And if
Mm-hmm.
you sort of, you know, if I chose not to have my business, for instance, and not to try to build it, then not only would all the women I've helped not have been helped, but also probably they would have spent that money on like another, you know, face cream that didn't work and actually stripped their skin, or, you know, or another weight loss cleanse, or another, it's
Yeah.
like that money
Yeah.
would just be going into the pockets of like Weight Watchers and L'Oreal.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no neutral just opting out as though you're not impacting this whole ecosystem that we're trying to change.
I love that. Boy, yeah, I got to go back and read that chapter again. This is something that seriously, like a lot of this is so relevant to me, and I know will be to so many people who read the book. So great. Okay, one last thing is something that we haven't explored as much as I want to. So I was super happy that it was in the book, is the intersection between patriarchy and capitalism, and how those two things create unique problems in society. Can you talk about that just for a minute?
Yeah, and I think actually I'm surprised we hadn't gotten to it yet in this conversation, but the whole book comes from an intersectional perspective, which means
Uh-huh.
it's not just capitalism, it's also race,
Yeah.
ethnicity, national origin, age, body size and type, neurodiverse, like all of these different, any identity you have, you are socialized in a certain way, and that socialization impacts your brain in different ways. So like the very first exercise in the book is actually going through all your different identities and listing out like what messages you received based on them.
Mm-hmm.
From the structural side, in terms of capitalism, I think that capitalism intersects with patriarchy in, I mean, like, God, so many ways. So we cannot cover them all. But like, for obviously the way that women's work is valued and what kind of work women do is given economic value and when it's not. So, you know, all of the kind of um traditional labor that women perform in the home, like sex, childbearing, child rearing, housework, cooking, those are all, right, just sort of not counted as economic labor when they're performed in the context of a relationship or in a family. I think it impacts us in terms of women's ability to rest, because women are socialized to believe that they should always be sort of serving other people or doing
Mm-hmm.
something to earn their worth. And capitalism also teaches us that productivity is what determines our worth and our value. So if you're socialized to believe that you don't have inherent worth, and then capitalism socializes you to believe that being productive is how you get worth, then women get in this constant, like, I need to be productive mindset. And also productive means like such a weird variety of things because it's not just work. It's also somehow like cleaning your house or exercising is productive.
Yeah.
It just has become like a catch-all category for anything that we deem to be morally good
Yep.
versus not. So I mean, there's like so many intersections.
Yeah, no, it was really, really great. And I loved how you talk about reclaiming time for our own priorities as a really important act of sovereignty that pushes back against that patriarchal and capitalistic framework of just saying like, no, I'm going to determine what my priorities are and use my time in a way that might not be on that list of acceptable activities. But yeah, I thought that was really useful.
You got to read chapter 9 to learn how to do that.
Yes. Well, we won't give everything away. And you're right. We are really just touching, like just the tip of the iceberg of the book. So, but we're about to the end of our episode. I just want to share one of my takeaways, Kara, and I'll read one just passage where you say, quote, feminism has not historically provided a solution to the emotional experience that this awareness or the awareness of patriarchy, basically, that this awareness created. It hasn't taught women what to do with all of those emotions and how to handle integrating the awareness of unfairness with the circumstances of their real lives. That's the end of the quote. And I know we talked about that at the beginning, but I just wanted to emphasize that again, how useful and valuable I found this book to be. So again, thank you. Thank you for your book. Thank you for your work. And this has just been an absolute delight to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much, Kara. And just one more reminder, Kara, of where people can find the book, because I really do recommend that people, like, as soon as you finish listening to this episode, go buy the book. Where can we find it again, Kara?
Yes, you can find the book anywhere books are sold. We've got the hardcover's out, audiobook is out, which I read myself, ebook, anywhere you usually get your books.
Okay, fabulous. And also tell us where to find all of your work. I know you have a fantastic Instagram account, for example, and websites. Where can we find everything else?
Yeah. My name is a little hard to spell, so I recommend you go to takebackyourbrainbook.com. There will also be links there to where you can buy the book, and then my social media is there. Just an easy home for everything.
Perfect. Well, thanks again so much, Kara Loewentheil. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me.